So, round of applause for Jessica. Welcome.
Okay. All right. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm a little bit nervous because this is the first presentation that I've done in a while publicly, so please bear with me. Today I'm going to, basically the reason I'm here is because last year I designed my own font and JF was like, hey, will you do a talk? And I said yes before I could say no. So that's why I'm here. As a comic artist, I think we often don't think about the text that well. We tend to find fonts are already made, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I wanted to make my own handwriting font. So today I'm going to slightly cover my own journey of my fonts, a little brief font design. There's lots of information out there, so I'm not going to go into it too much. Some comic-specific things you might need to think of, because there are some comic nuances and rules that they like to impose on us. And then I'm going to go into using FontForge. All right. Okay, so this is one of the first comics I ever did, which was actually for a client. At the time, it was only for education purposes. So we decided that we would use a very simple font. So I think here we actually used Arial, which is very boring, but for education purposes it was needed. I think most comic artists, first thing they do is look for system fonts, and they're very boring. The ones you find in Word or Adobe, and they're usually not that great for comics. The second stage of my journey was I started an online comic called Adopted the Comic. And I found these great online websites called Blambot and Font Squirrel, because when you start looking for free fonts online, when you want to go more serious, you have to be really careful about thinking about the copyright. So a lot of free fonts online, they're free to use for personal use only. So you do have to consider commercial use if you're using a free font. And then a couple of years ago, I decided that I wanted to possibly try and write my own comic. It's still in progress. And this is the first time that I started thinking about using my own handwriting. I'm actually very, very dyslexic, so I really rely on spell checking and that kind of thing, and I make a lot of corrections. So at first I had considered doing it by hand, and then changed my mind after a few mistakes. So just adding time is quite bad, so yeah. I had no idea how to make a font, so I went online, and the first few things that I found were font handwriting generators. And you basically that you print out a piece of paper and then you write on the paper, scan it in, and then they generate it into handwriting. So there are a few free ones online, but there are some pitfalls. So, for example, on this website, you can see that it vectored really badly. The letters are really jaggedy on the outside. But because it was kind of like a very reasonably priced to generate it for you, if you want to use it small, people might not notice. But if you want to use it in print, or if you want to use it for anything like logo design or branding, having it big, you will be able to see these mistakes. So it's not very good for professional use. Another website, you can see that it vectored a little bit better, but some of the problems are with the spacing. The spacing is terrible. The letter spacing is too close together, the word spacing is too far apart. And while you can do some minor corrections on a lot of text programs, it's really not ideal to use. So I kind of gave up on that idea for a few years. And then you can see that the top two fonts are the ones that I did online, that auto-generated. And the one at the bottom is the one that I have created using FontForge for free. You can see that there's a bit more nuance to it, and the weight is better, and it does look more like my actual handwriting. So when it comes to planning for a font, you actually do have to think ahead, because as you can see at the bottom, the character set is that this is a really basic character set, but it can get out of hand because you can have lots of diacritics or different languages, and you can have, and whatever you design in, like, say, regular font, you then might have to do an iteration in bold or italics, and then you're just multiplying each time you need to do a different font, because they all have to be done manually. So you need to think, what is your main use? So for example, in comics, you might want to be designing a text for dialogue, but sometimes dialogue text is not suitable for, like, sound effects. So you do have to think about your main use. You also have to think about whether you're doing it for print or screen. And you also have to think about whether it's readable small, because some fonts look great big or small, or not readable in other ways. I'm not going to be covering other languages today because, like, it's very complicated when you start getting into more complicated characters. And then you have to think about how many emphases you need. Okay, and from a comic point of view, I don't know if there's any comic people out there. There are some nuances and rules that are in traditional comics. So one of them is upper and lower case, or a sentence case. I tell you that there are massive debates between comic artists and traditionalists and typists and letterists about whether or not comics should be in uppercase or sentence case. The industry standard tends to be in uppercase, but you have to make that decision yourself. You also have to think about bolds and italics. So most people use bolds and italics on their own. So they either use bold or they either use italics. But in comics, if they emphasize words, they tend to use bold italics. So I didn't actually design one because I chose not to, but you guys might want to think about that if you are designing a comic. And like I mentioned before, you have to think about the size, whether it's big or small. When you're thinking about uppercase or lowercase, you also have to consider line height, because if you have, like, letters like D's that go, like, really high up, or if you have, like, letters that go very low under the line as well, you're adding white space between. And when you're doing comics, white space is precious in dialogue, so you have to think about that too. And then you also have, this is something I only learned last year, which is a capital I with bars and without bars. Traditionally, only bars are used with personal pronouns, acronyms, and names. And I think this stems from the fact that when people used to do hand lettering, they used to hate doing the I, and it was quicker just to do that and it saved space. But now it's just a rule that continues, and no one can really tell. I've never found a source that really explains why it's still like that, but they've just made it an industry standard. But again, it's your choice whether or not. If you're building a font, what you have to do instead is, because in some situations you do need the I with the bars, you then have to decide to make the lowercase l just a straight L, because you're just going to use that instead of the I. I don't know if I explained that correctly. So essentially you're going to be using the lowercase l as a capital I. And then, but if you're doing an uppercase font only, you only need to change the I. Okay, and here's a very, very brief diagram of typography anatomy. There is so much though, because letters have so many aspects to them, so this is a very, very, very cut down list, but I just wanted to get people to understand what's needed to make a font. So the basic sizes, heights, everyone knows what the baseline is, it's where it is. And then you have the X height, or the waistline, and this is like where the, the small letters basically fit within. And you have the cap height, and then you have the ascender line and the descender line. It's pretty straightforward. And then an M square is what they used to use in printing presses. So when they had little metal blocks, they used to put it all together when they were doing printing presses. So all your letters have to fit within this square, because font programs also use this idea of an M square. Okay, something that a lot of people actually don't realize is that fonts have optical illusions. And they're very, very subtle. So actually a lot of fonts adjust to these illusions to kind of make the letters more balanced. Letters, pretty much in English, the letters are pretty much made up of squares, circles, and triangles. So, for example, you can see that on the top line, a square shape is going to be flush to the surface. So, like a H, it will be quite flush. But if you have a curve, to make it look more balanced, you actually have to make the curve go a little bit beyond the line, ever so slightly. But then if you have a point, you have to make it go beyond the line even more. And you might not think this is the case, but actually if you go into your font and put a line across it, you'll notice that a lot of the curves or the points do go below the line. The other thing to consider is the vertical and horizontal lines. Those three lines, the thin, intermediate, and thick, they're actually all exactly the same width. But when they're vertical, it actually looks thinner than when it looks horizontal. So you can see the two examples of the H. On the left-hand side, it's actually all uniform, but it looks a bit weird. It does look a bit thick in the middle. So most fonts actually make it a bit thinner, the bar going across. And this idea of adjusting to the optical illusion also applies when you're doing letter spacing. So, for example, if you have two long letters together, you'll actually pull them apart because they'll look too close together. Or if you have like a long and a curve together, you'll actually move it closer together. And then I'm not going to explain too much the other things. So spacing is, you're going to have word spacing, letter spacing, line height, and something I'm going to introduce is kerning. And so while you can have letter spacing, sometimes you need to adjust that spacing to go beyond the point to make it look better, which is often done with A and V and T and O. Okay, and so when it comes to actually making your font, you have to decide how you're going to input that. In some ways, I'd actually say you shouldn't start with handwriting font because every single letter is different and it takes a lot of time and energy. But ultimately, everything has to be outputted in a vector. So when you set it up in your program, you should probably set it up so that it's all similar just to start out with. And then when you output, it's very important that every letter needs to be outputted to its own file. And this is probably the most tedious part of it, like cutting up and putting it into different files. When you output, everything has to fit within the EM square. And then when you're setting it up, you should make sure that it fits within 1024 or 2048, because that is the standard for fonts. And actually font programs are quite strict with that, so if you keep within that ratio, it's a lot easier when you start importing it into FontForge. If you don't have like Adobe or anything like that, there are some fantastic free programs you can use above, which is Inkscape and GIMP. Okay, so we get to FontForge, very exciting. Please go and download it, it's fantastic. It's almost like as powerful as a Pro, but it's open source and they update it, but what you get in freeness, you get a little bit in tedium, so that's the payoff, unfortunately. Okay, so this is, the UI is kind of terrible. Actually, I put them all very neatly here, but actually they're all pop-up windows, so you have to kind of sort them out. So you have the main font view window, the character view window, and the metrics view window. So the font view is where you get an overview of all the fonts when you put them in. When you double click, you get into the character view that you can do some editing. And then the metrics window is where you can actually type in letters to test the line spacing and the word spacing. You'll also want to look at these windows, which is basically the settings window, but you have to click onto it every time to get to it. And then you just be changing things like the font name and that kind of thing. But you'll also want to make sure that you set the ascending and descending lines in your font and that you've set it correctly. It has to add up. But we can look at that a bit later, but essentially that's what you're going to do. Okay, so to import, it's pretty simple. You just highlight the letter that you want to import, and then you open up your file all in lovely individually split up files that you've done earlier. And then it will end up being in the window. I beg you not to try and edit too much using the vector that's inside the program. It's really awkward to use, so make sure that it's pretty good vector before you go in it. But if you need to use it, you can use some of the tools that are available to you. Then you can see where the arrows are. If you click and drag those, that's where you can change the letter spacing for that particular character A. Okay, and then the next thing to do is just to keep importing, and while it looks really fast on this slide, it just takes time to open it, import, open, import. And the list of letters that I put down there are the good ones to start with, because all the alphabet is going to be roughly similar to those letters. So it's good to start with that. And then you can start typing in the box and you can see the spacing. Then you can make some little adjustments there using the spacing and you'll be able to see it live. The downside of this program is you can't look at line height, so you can only look at letter spacing and word spacing. So you have to go and do it in another program if you want to look at the line height. But you don't need to worry about that too much straight away. And then if you want to adjust the actual word spacing, you actually have to go to the character that is called space. So you need to find it there. It's usually just before the exclamation mark. And then you kind of adjust it like you would adjust the letters. And then you'll be able to see it live in the metrics window. And then the last thing that is a little complicated is the kerning. So I showed the example of the A and the V, and you want to make it a little bit closer together. So we want to set up kerning classes. So essentially, we're going to say all the letters that are similar to each other, and then we're going to just put them in a group, so that you don't have to do it for each individual one. So you need to go into the settings and follow the instructions. I can put all of these online afterwards, so you don't have to look at it all right now. You're basically going to pick the first letter of one class and the first letter of another class. So in this case, I'm going to say N and O. So kind of ignore the other highlighted ones. Okay, and this window will pop up, and so you can keep setting the classes. So for example, N and H, they kind of have a similar right-hand side, and then so for example, O, C, D, E, and Q have a similar left side, so you'd put them in one group as well. And then when you select two letters together, you can see how the spacing works between them, and then you can just pull an arrow that appears when you mouse over left and right to adjust the size, and then you just save just like that. And then we're getting towards the end now. I mean, this is a little bit more complicated, but I've just put it here. I will make it available online, but it's just about validation. Font programs are quite sticky with validation, so they want to make sure that everything's correct. And how do I go back? I pressed it by mistake. Oh, okay. Okay, so the main issue is that you might have imported vectors, but they're overlapping, so you've got to make sure they're all flattened together and merged together, which you can do within the program. You also have to make sure that the direction is correct. So for some letters, the font programs say that clockwise is the outside of the letter, and anti-clockwise is the middle. So for example, like an O, it has like the hole is the counter. So the font programs need to know if it's the inside or the outside of the hole, and it's unique to font programs. You might need to put extreme points, which is like the extreme part of a curve. So fonts prefer it if you have an outer most point, and so you can still get the program to add it for you automatically. I won't go into making anchors at this point, but that could be another validation issue. But EM height, it also has to add up. So that will be what you get to. And then basically when you've got to all this point, you just can go to the file and generate. You may have to, I would advise ticking validation so you can see what's mainly wrong with it. Follow the instructions, it's pretty clear and self-explanatory. And then once you've outputted, and I advise just for this tutorial to do true type font, and then you go and open it and install it onto your computer and test it out. So tips I have is that you should try and get it down early, like try and save it early so you can check the line heighting. And then you'll end up realizing you have to tweak certain things when you use it, so it's not going to be perfect first time. And start really simple, because I did the mistake of doing handwriting font. And also, if you're desperate to use it in Microsoft, you have to make sure that the kerning is switched on, because Microsoft doesn't automatically have it turned on. And then I ended up with a dialogue font for my comic. And Kat's comic over there, that we worked together on collaboratory. And thank you very much, and for bearing with me. I hope that this was a good starting point for everyone who wanted to learn a bit about fonts. And please feel free to come and say hi to us at the table over there and check us out. So thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I can try and answer them to the best of my ability.
How long does it take from start to finish to create this font that you did?
Well, because it was all a bit of a learning curve for me. I literally presented in 15-20 minutes what it took me to learn in about 3 months. So it took, from start to finish, it took me 3 weeks. So that was a lot, and that was blood, sweat and tears of 3 weeks. But it was worth it, because now I don't have to worry about handwriting any text, which actually takes a lot of streamlining time out of it. So yeah, which is good. But I kind of you should be aware of how long it might take. But it's worth it. Actually being able to have a font that you've made is actually kind of amazing, because most of the time people just take for granted the fact that these fonts appear on their computer automatically. But when you're doing comics or any other kind of design, you start actually thinking about letters. And despite the fact that I'm really dyslexic, I actually find letters extremely fascinating. So. Oh, sorry.
All right, no questions for
okay.
Jess?
All right.
Thank you very much, Jessica.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.